Truman, by David McCullough. Introduction. Narrator. Have you ever wondered what makes a great leader? Not the kind you see in movies, born in a palace or destined for power from their first breath. I'm talking about something real. Something unexpected. Picture this, April 12, 1945. A man, thrust into the most powerful office on earth, feels as if, in his own words, the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't an Ivy League scholar. He was a farmer from Missouri, a failed small business owner, a man who, by all accounts, was spectacularly ordinary. And yet, this ordinary man, Harry S. Truman, would go on to face some of the most monumental decisions of the 20th century. He would bring a world war to its terrifying conclusion with a weapon of unimaginable power, confront the rise of Soviet communism, and rebuild a shattered Europe. Today, we're diving deep into a book that isn't just a story about a president, it's a story about the hidden power of character. It's Truman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning masterpiece by the brilliant historian David McCullough. This isn't just a book, it's a phenomenon. It spent nearly a year on the bestseller lists and was hailed by critics as one of the greatest presidential biographies ever written. And the man who wrote it, David McCullough, is a master storyteller. He grew up in Pittsburgh, fell in love with history not in a university classroom, but by discovering old photographs in the Library of Congress. He writes history not as a dry collection of dates, but as a thrilling, human story. He makes you feel like you're there. And that's my promise to you today. By the end of our journey together, you won't just know about Harry Truman. You will understand the secret that propelled this man from Missouri from obscurity to greatness. You'll discover a timeless lesson about how integrity, resilience, and a deep sense of duty can forge an extraordinary life out of the most common clay. This isn't just a book summary, it's a guide to the heart of leadership and the quiet strength that lies within every one of us. So, settle in, and let's begin the story of the man nobody saw coming. Book summary. Have you ever felt like you were just average? Like you were a quiet, hard-working person, but maybe not destined for the spotlight? I think most of us feel that way. And that, right there, is the perfect place to start the story of Harry S. Truman. Because more than anything else, he was one of us. His story doesn't begin in a seat of power. It begins in the dirt, in the heartland of America, in what was called the Blue River country of westernmost Missouri. His family, the Trumans and the Youngs, were pioneers. They were farmers of Scotch-Irish and German descent who came west from Kentucky in the 1840s, seeking a new life on the frontier. These weren't downtrodden people. They were proud, plain-spoken Democrats who believed that those who worked the earth were, as Thomas Jefferson said, the chosen people of God. They were tough, independent, and deeply loyal to their own. They carried Bibles, rifles, and a stubborn belief in common sense. Think of Harry's grandfather, Solomon Young. The man was a force of nature. He started with nothing and built a small empire, freighting goods across the prairie in giant wagon trains, facing every hardship imaginable, from brutal weather to financial ruin, and always coming back. He was a big man with a booming voice who liked to say that whenever he heard a man praying too loudly, his first instinct was to go home and lock the smokehouse. He was skeptical, self-reliant, and taught his family that you stood by your word, no matter what. Harry's mother, Martha Ellen Young, or Mattie, was her father's daughter. She was bright, lively, and had that same core of steel. She learned to use a rifle as well as any man and had a deep love of books and history. She was the one who taught young Harry to read before he was 5, sitting with him in her lap, using the big family Bible as their textbook. Harry's father, John Truman, was a smaller, quieter man, but just as hard-working and ambitious. He was a farmer and livestock trader, known for being honest, cheerful, but also possessing a fiery temper. He was a man who believed in trying and trying again, and never, ever giving up. This was the world that shaped Harry Truman, born in a tiny six-room house in Lamar, Missouri, on May 8, 1884. He was a farm boy, through and through. His earliest memories were of the sprawling young family farm, a place of seemingly endless fields, of riding his Shetland pony beside his father, of the comforting rhythms of planting and harvest. But there was something different about Harry from the start. He wasn't like the other boys. He was quiet, neat, and intensely studious. And then there were his eyes. From a young age, he suffered from a rare condition called flat eyeballs, which meant he was practically blind without thick, double-strength glasses. In the rough-and-tumble world of a late 19th century Missouri farm town, a boy in thick spectacles who would rather read a book than play baseball was an oddity. To tell the truth, he admitted years later, I was kind of a sissy. He ran from fights. The glasses kept him out of sports, and this set him apart, creating a sense of loneliness that many children feel, but that was especially acute for him. So, he found his refuge elsewhere. His mother, seeing his predicament, didn't pamper him, but she did encourage his other talents. For his 10th birthday, she gave him a set of books called Great Men and Famous Women. It was a turning point. While other boys were idolizing baseball players, Harry was reading about the lives of Hannibal, Andrew Jackson, and Robert E. Lee. He read Plutarch's Lives, a gift from his father. He devoured the family Bible, cover to cover, twice by the time he was 12. History wasn't just a subject for him, it was a conversation with the past, a source of guidance and inspiration. He came to believe that character was the engine of history. It wasn't great events that made great men, it was great men who made great events. And there was music. He started piano lessons, getting up at 5 o'clock every morning to practice for 2 hours before his farm chores began. He became so good that he traveled to Kansas City for lessons with a teacher who had studied with the greats of Europe. For a time, he even dreamed of becoming a concert pianist. Think about that. The boy they might have called a sissy, the boy who couldn't play sports, was developing an intense, quiet discipline that would define the rest of his life. There was one other person who captured his attention. In Sunday school, he met a little girl with blonde hair and beautiful blue eyes named Elizabeth Wallace. Bessie, as everyone called her. He was instantly smitten, but so shy it took him 5 years even to say hello. She was everything he wasn't: popular, athletic, outgoing. She could run faster and play baseball better than her brothers. She was his ideal, and for years, he worshipped her from afar. When he graduated from high school in 1901, the future seemed wide open. He dreamed of going to West Point, of becoming a great general like the heroes in his books. But his poor eyesight made that impossible. And then, just a year after graduation, his world turned upside down. His father, John Truman, who had been speculating in the Kansas City grain market, lost everything. The family was wiped out. They had to sell their home and move to Kansas City, where John Truman, a man of immense pride, took a job as a night watchman. For Harry, any dream of college vanished. At a time when his friends were heading off to university, he was taking whatever jobs he could find to help support his family. He worked as a timekeeper for a railroad construction crew, living in tent camps with rough laborers. It was a down-to-earth education, as he called it. Then he landed a job as a clerk in a bank in Kansas City, working long hours in the basement vault for a meager salary. For the next decade, this was Harry Truman's life. Not a life of adventure or distinction, but of quiet, dutiful work. He was a good son, sending money home, taking care of his family. But his ambitions seemed to have stalled. He was a young man without much in the way of prospects. And then, in 1906, his father and grandmother asked him to come home and run the family farm. At 22 years old, the young man who had once dreamed of being a concert pianist or a general put on his work boots and went back to the land. For the next 10 years, he was a farmer. He rose before dawn, drove a gang plow behind a team of 4 horses, mended fences, and raised prize-winning hogs. It was hard, grueling work, but it was also a time of profound growth. He learned about the land, about the markets, about managing men. He read voraciously in his spare time, studying history, government, and agricultural science. And most importantly, he reconnected with Bess Wallace. He had started visiting her again, making the long trip from the farm to her family's grand house in Independence. He wrote her hundreds of letters, pouring out his heart, his dreams, his frustrations. He was still a man of modest means, a simple farmer, while she was a popular young woman from one of the town's most prominent families. He proposed to her in a letter in 1911, and she turned him down. But he didn't give up. His persistence, his quiet devotion, and his unshakable belief in himself finally won her over. They became secretly engaged, with the understanding that they would marry when he could properly provide for her. But the world was changing. In 1917, as war raged in Europe, the United States was drawn into the conflict. And Harry Truman, now 33 years old, a farmer with thick glasses, well past the prime age for a soldier, decided it was his duty to go. He helped organize an artillery battery in the Missouri National Guard and, through a combination of sheer will and memorizing the eye chart, he managed to pass the physical. His men, a rowdy bunch of Irish Catholics from Kansas City known as Dizzy D, were skeptical of this quiet, bespectacled farmer who was now their captain. They thought he was a pushover. They were wrong. On their first night under German fire in the mountains of France, the battery panicked. Men started to run. Truman, who had been thrown from his horse and nearly crushed, got to his feet and unleashed a torrent of profanity so shocking, so out of character, that it stopped the men dead in their tracks. "I got up and called them everything I knew," he later said. That was the night they learned who their captain really was. He was terrified, he admitted, but he was too scared to run. From that moment on, the men of Battery D would have followed him anywhere. He had discovered something in himself he never knew he had. He could lead men. The war was the great turning point of his life. He came home a hero, a respected captain, and in 1919, at the age of 35, he finally married his sweetheart, Bess Wallace. The future looked bright. With his Army friend Eddie Jacobson, he opened a men's clothing store, a haberdashery, in downtown Kansas City. For a time, they were a great success. They were riding the wave of post-war prosperity. And then, just as it happened with his father, the economy turned. A recession hit, and in 1922, the store failed. Harry was bankrupt, deeply in debt to his friends and family. He was 38 years old, married, a veteran, and a failure. It was the low point of his life. He had tried farming. He had tried business. He didn't know where to turn. And it was at that moment that politics, in a very particular Missouri fashion, came calling. Now, to understand what happened next, you have to understand something about Kansas City in the 1920s. It was a wide-open town, run by one of the most powerful and corrupt political machines in American history, the Pendergast machine. Headed by boss Tom Pendergast, the machine controlled everything: jobs, contracts, the police, and most importantly, votes. They were Democrats, but they were a special breed. They got things done, but they didn't always do it cleanly. It was Jim Pendergast, the nephew of the big boss, who had served with Harry in the war. He saw something in his old captain, honesty, a good name, and a network of loyal friends and family all over the county. The Pendergasts needed a candidate for county judge, an administrative, not a judicial, position, and they thought Harry Truman was the perfect man. He was a farmer, a veteran, a Baptist, and a Mason, all of which would appeal to the voters outside the city. Harry was hesitant. He didn't have money or political experience. But he needed a job. He accepted their offer. And with the backing of the machine, he won. It was the beginning of his political career, a career born from failure and forged in the complicated, morally ambiguous world of machine politics. For the next 10 years, he served as a county judge, overseeing roads, bridges, and public buildings. And he did an extraordinary job. He was scrupulously honest in a system that was famously corrupt. He built some of the best roads in the state, on time and under budget. He insisted on honest contracts, even when it angered the Pendergast cronies. Tom Pendergast, a hard-nosed realist, recognized Truman's integrity as a political asset. "He's the contrariest cuss in Missouri," Pendergast once said, but he let Truman run things his own way. Truman was learning the art of government from the ground up. He was learning how to manage budgets, how to deal with people, and how to get things done. He was building a reputation not just as an honest man, but as a man who was incredibly competent. In 1934, when a U.S. Senate seat opened up, Tom Pendergast, after being turned down by several other candidates, reluctantly gave the nod to Truman. It was a long shot. Truman was little known outside of Jackson County. His opponents labeled him a bellhop for the Pendergast machine. But he campaigned tirelessly, crisscrossing the state in his old Dodge, talking to farmers and small-town folks in a language they understood. And, with the full force of the Pendergast machine turning out the vote in Kansas City, he won. When he arrived in Washington, he was 50 years old. He was known as the senator from Pendergast, and many looked down on him. He felt like he was under a cloud. But he did what he had always done. He worked. He put his head down, studied the issues, and earned the respect of his colleagues, not with flashy speeches, but with his deep knowledge and quiet diligence. His great moment in the Senate came with the war. As the country began to mobilize, Truman, remembering the waste and profiteering he had seen in World War I, grew concerned. He got in his car and drove thousands of miles, visiting defense plants and military bases on his own dime. What he saw appalled him: mismanagement, waste, and corporate greed on a massive scale. He proposed a special Senate committee to investigate the National Defense Program. The White House was against it, fearing it would hamper the war effort. But Truman persisted, and the Truman Committee, as it came to be known, was one of the great success stories of the home front. It saved the country billions of dollars, rooted out corruption, and made war production more efficient. And it made Harry Truman a national figure. He was no longer the senator from Pendergast. He was a respected, hard-nosed patriot who was saving the taxpayers' money. He even made the cover of Time magazine. In 1944, as Franklin Roosevelt prepared to run for an unprecedented fourth term, the question of his vice president became a point of intense political maneuvering. The current vice president, Henry Wallace, was seen as too liberal, too eccentric, by the party bosses. They wanted him out. After a series of secret meetings and backroom deals, they settled on the man they thought would do the ticket the least harm, the senator from Missouri, Harry Truman. Truman didn't want the job. He was happy in the Senate. "The vice president simply presides over the Senate and sits around hoping for a funeral," he told a friend. And he knew, as did everyone else, that Roosevelt's health was failing. The man they were choosing for vice president would very likely become president. It was a thought that terrified him. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Truman was torn. He had promised to nominate his friend, Jimmy Burns. But the party bosses, with a reluctant nod from Roosevelt, were insisting he was the one. The pressure was immense. Finally, in a smoke-filled hotel room, the head of the Democratic Party, Bob Hannigan, got Roosevelt on the phone. "Bob," the president's voice boomed so loudly everyone in the room could hear, "have you got that fellow lined up yet?" Hannigan said Truman was being stubborn. "Well, you tell the senator," Roosevelt said, "that if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of the war, that's his responsibility." Truman was stunned. He felt like he had been hit by a lightning bolt. "Well, if that's the situation," he said, "I'll have to say yes. But why the hell didn't he tell me in the first place?" He was nominated. He campaigned hard for the Roosevelt-Truman ticket, and they won a decisive victory. For 82 days, Harry Truman served as Vice President of the United States. He saw the president only a handful of times. Roosevelt, a man who kept his own counsel, told him almost nothing about the great secrets of the war, or his plans for the peace to follow. Then, on the afternoon of April 12, 1945, Truman was presiding over the Senate when he received an urgent message to call the White House. He rushed over, entering through the main entrance on Pennsylvania Avenue. Eleanor Roosevelt met him in her upstairs study. She put her arm on his shoulder and said, "Harry, the president is dead." He was speechless. The weight of the world had just fallen on him. "Is there anything I can do for you?" he finally asked her. "Is there anything we can do for you?" she replied. "For you are the one in trouble now." In that moment, the farmer's son, the failed haberdasher, the sissy who ran from fights, became the 33rd President of the United States. And the world held its breath. He stepped into the Oval Office as a man inheriting a whirlwind. The war in Europe was in its final, bloody days, but the war in the Pacific raged on with terrifying ferocity. He knew next to nothing of the great, secret strategies and understandings that Roosevelt had held so close. His own Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, had to inform him of a secret project to build a weapon of unbelievable power, the atomic bomb. He was faced with a series of decisions that would shape the course of history for the rest of the century. And he faced them with a directness and courage that stunned those around him. When the war in Europe ended, he traveled to Potsdam, Germany, to meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin for the first time. He was a plain-spoken man from Missouri, sitting at the table with two of the most formidable figures in history. He found Churchill charming but long-winded. He found Stalin direct, honest, but smart as hell. "I can deal with Stalin," he wrote in his diary. It was at Potsdam that he received the secret message that the atomic bomb had been successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. The decision of whether to use it was now his. It was, he later said, the most terrible decision a man ever had to make. His military advisors told him that an invasion of Japan could cost 250,000 American lives, or more. He thought of the boys who wouldn't be killed. He made the decision. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. A few days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was over. But peace brought its own set of crises. The nation was plunged into labor strife, with massive strikes in the steel, coal, and railroad industries. Inflation was rampant. There was a desperate housing shortage. His popularity plummeted. He was derided in the press as a little man, unequal to the job. But he fought back. When the railroad unions threatened to paralyze the nation, he went before Congress and threatened to draft the striking workers into the army. The strike ended in minutes. The greatest challenge, however, came from abroad. The alliance with the Soviet Union had shattered. Europe was in ruins, facing starvation and chaos. In a speech before Congress in March 1947, Truman laid out what would become known as the Truman Doctrine. He declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who were resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. It was a direct challenge to Soviet expansion. A few months later, his Secretary of State, the great General George C. Marshall, proposed a plan for the economic recovery of Europe, the Marshall Plan. It was a bold, generous act that would rebuild a continent and stand as one of the great achievements of the post-war era. When the Soviets blockaded Berlin in 1948, cutting off the city from the West, Truman refused to back down. Against the advice of some of his military leaders, he ordered a massive airlift that would supply the city for nearly a year, a stunning demonstration of American resolve and ingenuity that broke the blockade without firing a shot. And then came 1948. Facing re-election, Truman seemed to have no chance. The polls, the press, the professional politicians all said he was finished. His own party was fractured, with a Southern Dixiecrat revolt on one side and Henry Wallace's Progressive Party on the other. The Republican candidate, Thomas E. Dewey, was so confident of victory that he ran a campaign of bland platitudes, avoiding any real issues. But Truman refused to believe it. He got on a train and took his case to the people. In a legendary whistle-stop campaign, he traveled over 21,000 miles, delivering hundreds of fiery, off-the-cuff speeches from the rear platform of his train. He lambasted the do-nothing Republican 80th Congress, defended his policies, and connected with ordinary Americans in a way that no one thought possible. The crowds grew larger and more enthusiastic with every stop. "Give 'em hell, Harry," became the rallying cry of the campaign. On election night, he went to bed early, confident of victory, while the experts were still predicting his defeat. The next morning, the world awoke to the greatest political upset in American history. Harry S. Truman, the man nobody wanted, the man they had all written off, was president in his own right. His second term was dominated by the Cold War. In 1949, the Soviets exploded their own atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly. China fell to the Communists. And in June 1950, the world was plunged into a new crisis when Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. Truman acted swiftly and decisively. He committed American troops to a police action under the banner of the United Nations. It was a brutal, bloody war, a meat grinder, as the soldiers called it. After a brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, led by General Douglas MacArthur, it seemed victory was at hand. But when MacArthur pushed his forces to the Chinese border, against warnings from Washington, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured into the conflict, turning the tide of the war and leading to a long, disastrous retreat. MacArthur wanted to widen the war, to attack China, possibly with atomic weapons. Truman refused. He was determined to fight a limited war, to prevent a Third World War. When MacArthur publicly challenged the president's authority, Truman faced the most difficult decision of his presidency. He fired the general, a national hero, an act that brought a firestorm of criticism down on his head. "I could no longer tolerate his insubordination," Truman said simply. It was a profound affirmation of the principle of civilian control over the military, and a demonstration of the quiet steel at the core of the man. The war dragged on, his popularity sank to new lows, and in 1952, he chose not to run again. He had served his country, he had done his best, and now it was time to go home. When he left the White House in 1953, he returned to the same simple house in Independence, Missouri, where he had courted his wife. He was just Mr. Truman again. He had no pension but his small army one, no corporate boards to join. He wrote his memoirs, helped build his presidential library, and lived the quiet life of a private citizen. He was the man from Independence. The ordinary man who, through an extraordinary life, taught us that the strength of a leader lies not in pedigree or polish, but in character. It lies in the courage to make hard decisions, the integrity to stand by your word, and an unshakable faith in the wisdom of the common person. His was a life that proved that in America, the most profound power can rise from the most unexpected places. Commentary. When you close a book like David McCullough's Truman, you don't just put down a story. You feel like you've spent time with a person, a real person, and you're a little bit different for it. What stays with you isn't just the litany of presidential decisions, the bomb, the Marshall Plan, Korea. It's the man himself. It's the quiet power of his character. Think about it. In an age that often celebrates flash over substance, Truman's life is a powerful reminder that the bedrock of true leadership is integrity. He was a man who, in his own words, tried to live by the lessons he learned in Sunday school and from his mother. He believed in telling the truth, paying your debts, and standing by your friends, even when it was politically difficult. His loyalty to the Pendergast machine, which brought him so much criticism, was, in his mind, a matter of honor. They had given him his start, and he would not turn his back on them. Was it complicated? Absolutely. But for Truman, loyalty wasn't a political calculation, it was a fundamental part of who he was. And that's a lesson that resonates so powerfully today. At 17, you're on the cusp of building your own life, your own reputation. The world will present you with countless shortcuts, countless opportunities to bend your principles for a quick gain. Truman's life shows us that your character, that inner compass of right and wrong, is the most valuable thing you will ever build. It's what you fall back on when the world feels like it's falling apart. Another powerful lesson from Truman is the importance of resilience. This was a man who failed. He failed as a farmer. He failed as a haberdasher, going bankrupt and spending nearly 20 years paying off his debts. He was an accidental president, a man many thought was a mistake. But he never, ever gave up. If at first you don't succeed, try again, was one of his father's favorite sayings, and it became the rhythm of his life. His story teaches us that failure is not a final verdict. It's a comma, not a period. It's an opportunity to learn, to grow stronger, and to find a different path. Your ability to get back up after being knocked down will define your success far more than any single victory. So, what can we take from this, right now, today? Here are a couple of simple, practical actions inspired by the life of Harry Truman. First, become a student of history. Truman was one of the most well-read presidents in American history, and his deep knowledge of the past gave him a perspective that was essential to his decision-making. He believed that the only new thing in the world is the history you don't know. You don't have to read 1,000-page biographies. Start small. Pick a figure you admire, a period that fascinates you, and just read. Understanding where we've come from is the best tool for figuring out where we're going. Second, take responsibility. Truman's most famous motto was "The buck stops here." He had a sign with those words on his desk in the Oval Office. It meant that he accepted the ultimate responsibility for every decision, good or bad. In your own life, start practicing that principle. When you make a mistake, own it. Don't blame others. Don't make excuses. It's a simple act, but it's the cornerstone of trust and respect. It's what separates leaders from followers. In the end, the story of Harry S. Truman is a profoundly American story. It's a testament to the idea that greatness isn't something you're born with, but something you build, day by day, through hard work, honest dealing, and an unshakable belief in yourself and the people around you. He was the common man who rose to an uncommon challenge and, in doing so, became one of the most consequential leaders of our time. That was the story of Truman by David McCullough. We've touched on the major moments today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a sketch. The real color, the real depth, comes when you immerse yourself in the book. It's in the quiet moments, when one of McCullough's beautifully crafted sentences or a small, personal detail from Truman's life connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This podcast is a map, designed to show you the terrain and point you in the right direction. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or stirred something in you, I urge you to get a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see leadership, character, and the potential that lies within your own life. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us reach more people, and it ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and keep growing together.